This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, all. We are just waiting a few more minutes for folks to join us, so just sit tight. Hi all, this is Greg Johnson with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. We are going to give it another minute or two to get some other folks on the line, and then we'll get things going here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is Greg Johnson with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Thanks to everyone who is joining us today. This is our technical update webinar for the Statewide Water Supply Initiative, SWSI. We are actually renaming everything. I'll get into a little more detail about how we're using the branding from the water plan for all of the different updates that we have forthcoming in the next few years. So we'll be talking more about that. I'm going to kick things off with just a little bit of background on the process, where we've been, and kind of where we're headed. And then I'm going to hand things over to Bjorn Courtney with Element Water, who is our expert who's worked on this project specifically for the municipal and self-supplied industrial part of the analysis. So stay tuned for Bjorn. First, I'm going to go into a little bit more background here on again, where we've been and where we're going with the process. Let's see here. Slides are locking up. There we go. So as I said, I'm going to get into a little bit on the water plan goals and the methodologies. For folks who are really looking for more background information, we do have a lot of materials up on the website, as well as the first technical webinar that we did about a month ago in February was about 50-50. Half of that was background information on the technical analysis and update that we're doing on the water plan. And then the other half of that was a really good summary of the population projections that we have, how we got the data from the State Demographer's Office, and then Doug Jevons, who is our expert on the population methodology, went through a lot of the detail on how we used that population information and then applied that to the 5 different planning scenarios that we have. So if you are curious, that is up on the website. You can listen through the whole webinar that we have, as well as find the materials for the presentation that we had gone through. And then again, we're going to get into the municipal and self-supplied industrial, some of the projections, a lot of information on the methodology, how we did the calculations, and some of the implications for how we did some of that. So we want to point back to everything that we're doing is really an outgrowth of the Colorado Water Plan, and specifically Chapter 11 of the plan. Very simple, 1 page. This is really the part where we set forward the next steps of how we are going to move this plan forward. And then specifically the different components that we have, so be it the basin implementation plan, so the local roundtable component, the water plan itself, the water plan proper, and all the policy objectives and recommendations that it has, and then the statewide water supply initiative. So when we are going to really kind of launch into each of these different phases, we have stayed true to the schedule. So you'll notice that it says year initiated for each of those different things. And of course, each of these different items takes years to really get through and crunch the numbers and get the data out there. So we did kick off the statewide water supply initiative, so this technical analysis work in 2016. I believe we actually officially had started that in 2015. We will be releasing the full study later this year in July at our July board meeting. Last year, we did start the process to update the basin implementation plans. We are in the thick of the work to really figure out what that assignment is, what that guidance is, and to really, once this technical data is released from the technical analysis that we're doing, to really then pivot right away to working with the roundtables on updating the local component. So what does this mean for updating the basin plan? So we have a whole separate working group that is working through all the different aspects of that. So we've got volunteers from each of the roundtables. We actually just had our third official meeting of that group this morning, and they are helping us think through some of the details on things like project data and how we go through update some of that information and the components that maybe don't need to be updated. So a lot of work is occurring there to really set the stage for where we're going next, and then we initiate an update to the water plan itself in the year 2020, with the hope being that we can wrap that up by 2022. So a lot more information there. That really just skims the surface, but we are always happy to answer questions today or otherwise. And then again, we've got the materials that I pointed to. So this is what I had alluded to earlier. We are really using the water plan branding for everything that we're doing. With the water plan coming out in 2015 in response to Governor Hickenlooper's executive order in 2013, we have this whole momentum now moving forward for the major policies and the heavy lift of coordination of all these different things going on in the world of water under the umbrella of the water plan. And I think just as the basin plans had fed directly into the water plan, certainly this will happen again moving forward with our updates to the basin plans. And then also with this technical analysis, this update coming forward this summer, they're all integral parts of the water plan. So we've got this kind of ABC, that the analysis, the basin phase, and then really the comprehensive update to the plan itself that we're really working with moving forward. So again, today I'd mentioned we are getting into the municipal and self-supplied industrial methodology. All of this really ties back to the consistent statewide framework. So everything that we're doing with this technical update is intended to provide that consistent statewide way that we can look at the data, and so that everyone throughout the state, different roundtables, have the same framework that they're operating off of. We're also working on supplying a number of tools as well that are a component of this project. So we have a number of case studies and other things that will help to update kind of the local work and the basin plans moving forward. That fact sheet that you see an image of there is one of many that we have available on our website. So we have a two-page fact sheet. We did our best to boil down the most important parts of the methodologies for each of these different things, as well as that overview fact sheet. So those are all available on the website as well. I would add that we have the Colorado Water Conservation Board primary website, as well as the Colorado Water Plan website, which is independent. Of course, it is linked, big blue box, I believe, on our main web page. But most of this information is going to be actually housed on the Colorado Water Plan website. And stay tuned on that note too. We are in the process of a major overhaul of our website. So apologies for any hiccups there, but we do have all the information and are really trying to work with that water plan website to make it as easily accessible as possible. And then I wanted to point out the schedule for these different technical webinars that we're doing. Again, these are being recorded. We hope that they will serve as a good resource moving forward when folks have more specific questions and need a good overview for how we went about some of these different calculations. In February, we did do that initial one that I mentioned, focusing on the overview as well as the population data. And then today, of course, we're doing the municipal and self-supplied industrial, agriculture for the month of April, moving on to environmental data and the methodologies in May, and then finally visiting some of those tools and the next steps in June of this year. And then finally, I just wanted to remind folks, many folks participating have probably seen this before, but in a nutshell, if you don't take away anything else or did not have a chance to dive into the overview on the previous webinar or otherwise are unfamiliar with what we're doing, our assignment this time around it incorporates scenario planning. It's a methodology for planning moving forward. Instead of kind of drawing a straight line and looking at different bounds, high, medium, and low for these potential future options, you instead formulate different scenarios, different potential futures, all equally plausible, where we may end up moving forward, and then really look at the different drivers behind those futures. So things like population growth, whether or not population growth is higher than expected or lower, or maybe right on the projections that we have. Things like the impacts of climate and temperature and how that impacts hydrology. So we're looking at all those different variables, looking at these different 5 scenarios that we have. These 5 scenarios were actually developed by the work of the roundtables and the Interbasin Compact Committee. They were incorporated directly into the water plan, but at the time they were fairly conceptual. So they were a narrative scenario, a description for each of these 5 different potential futures. And our job moving forward with this whole technical analysis, with this process, is to take each of those scenarios and put numbers to it, to quantitatively use the data that we have to then look at where we might end up if we were to fall into each of these different 5 potential futures. So it results in a wealth of information, a whole lot of data. The other big piece that is different this time around is that in doing that analysis, in kind of running those numbers, we are taking advantage of some fairly robust modeling tools, computer modeling tools that we have at the state level, called the Colorado Decision Support System models. So we are using those. Those are hydrologic models. It's a water rights allocation model, so it has the whole stream network, where water is coming into the stream, where it's going off the stream for various diversions and irrigation and whatnot. And by using those models and all the data behind them, which is based on all sorts of state data and federal data, and largely data that we work with through the Division of Water Resources, we are able to look into a level of detail at these potential future conditions that we weren't able to do before. So we're really excited to leverage the investment. This is a project that we've been working on with the state as far as developing these models since 1992 in conjunction with the Division of Water Resources. So this is really our first attempt statewide to use them in a future planning process like this. And of course, they've been used for a number of years by different entities across the state to do kind of similar projection work. So, so between scenario planning and the modeling, it's a very different exercise this time around, but something that we're very excited about to be able to have this firepower. And with that, I'd like to introduce Bjorn Courtney, who's the president of Element Water Consulting. Bjorn has a wonderful background with municipal water providers, with all sorts of work with conservation data, not only on this particular project, but the first time around, or at least with the Statewide Water Supply Initiative in 2010, and has really used that background and leveraged it to move things forward with the updated information we have now that we can really plug into this modeling effort moving forward. So I'll turn it over to Bjorn.
Thank you, Greg. That's a very generous introduction. So I don't think I can beat that, what Greg just said, but just for those of you who don't know too much about Element Water Consulting, we did, as Greg said, help prepare the municipal and self-supplied industrial demands. And so for short, on this webinar and in documentation, a lot of times we'll refer to this as MNSSI. So that's the acronym for this topic today. And we did this update, the technical analysis for this update. Element did this work in conjunction with Water DM, and we actually, Peter Mayer of Water DM and I worked on SWSI 2010 in preparing the municipal demand savings projections for that phase of the project. So Element Water Consulting we're a water resources consulting firm, and we have a lot of experience in water demand projections and related types of studies. And then our other role on this technical update was contributing to the Jacobs team, who prepared the scenario planning or led the scenario planning technical advisory group, and then also providing recommendations to Wilson Water Group, who is the one that was responsible for the hydrologic modeling that Greg just talked about. So we're really been excited to be part of the team and see how this planning has evolved in a relatively short amount of time. So let's talk about what's changed. There are some very exciting things that have changed in this MNSSI topic and improvements. And the biggest improvement that we have is we have a substantial amount of new water use data to create what we call the baseline, so the starting water demands for the projections. So this donut chart here on the right of the slide shows that we had a whole new data source that came out of a House bill that was passed in 2010, and it was called House Bill 1051 that year. So the database that houses the data that came out of that bill and the statute gets referred to as 1051 data, and we'll refer to that a lot. So remember, that's where it came from. That gave us about 70% of the state's population was represented with water use data from that new source. That's a huge new source of information. And then we were also able to add to that with new municipal water efficiency plans and some data we were able to get out of the basin implementation plans. And then in addition, CWCB conducted some outreach to locations where we really didn't have much representation in the data. So the really great thing about these sources relative to what we had in 2010 is that almost all of this data gave us municipal water use at a customer category level, which is a stark contrast to where we were in 2010, where a lot of times we just had a system-wide total demand, but we didn't know how that broke down in the different customer classes, which is important when we do the projections. And then sometimes we only had something like one data point for an entire basin that gave us any indication of how those customer categories broke down. So this is a huge improvement, and it's only going to get better over time because this 1051 database keeps living on and new data gets reported every year. So aside from that, I think Greg covered well the biggest changes to the MNSSI methodology, which are around incorporating the scenario planning approach, which we're going to talk a lot about today. And then finally, another difference was that we, this time around, prepared the MNSSI demands for input into those hydrologic models that Greg talked about. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Thanks. So just on the data topic, we're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about individual river basin results, but it's important for you to know all of the analysis that we're going to show the results today for. All of that analysis is completed at a county level, and it all gets represented and summarized by basin. And so what the chart on this slide shows you is in the gray, we've got bars showing the per capita water use, just municipal, for each basin throughout the state. And then the green, the gray is the SWSI 2010 baseline, which was the year 2008. And the green is the update, which is a baseline of 2015. And if you look all the way to the far right, that is the statewide weighted average of all the population throughout those basins. And so on a statewide basis, the demand has decreased from about 172 GPCD in SWSI 2010 to about 164 GPCD, which is about a 5% reduction in demands over that time. But if you look at the individual basins, what you see is there's a much bigger difference at a basin level throughout many of the basins. And these differences are, in looking at the differences, we believe they are largely attributable to the updated data, but then they also reflect actual demand reductions due to conservation efforts and just ongoing behavioral changes that have driven the per capita water demands down. And then in some places where you see an increase in the demands, that also could just be due to new and improved data, or it could also be due to the fact that this time, particularly through that 1051 reporting, we actually have demands associated with raw water, so non-potable uses, and reuse water supplies. We have those reflected here now in the GPCD numbers, which was important for the river basin modeling. And we're not so sure. We suspect we didn't have that included in all of the SWSI 2010 numbers. So now back to the scenarios. This slide is the graphic from the Colorado Water Plan, and it describes the 5 scenarios, and it's got the overall guidance on how different aspects of factors that influence demand should be incorporated into the scenarios. And in this webinar, we've circled the bottom row, which is labeled M&I needs. That's municipal and industrial sometimes gets called M&I versus MNSSI. It's effectively the same thing for today. That's an important row to take a minute to look at. It shows the relative ranking for the MNSSI demands. So that was interpreted as a guiding principle for the combined. So at this point, we're talking both municipal and self-supplied industrial combined demands on a statewide scale. And again, it should be noted that we did all of that analysis at a county level, but and those individual basins can look pretty different, but what we were shooting for on a statewide basis is that the total combined demands would come out in this order. So the weak economy would have the lowest volumetric demand, and the hot growth would have the highest volumetric demand. And even though this is the combined demand, and we'll come back to this at the end of the webinar, when we talk about MNSSI demands, there's really 2 separate components, the municipal and then the self-supplied industrial. And then we add them together. And the methodologies for those 2 are so different that it makes sense to separate them out when we talk about them. So first in this webinar, we're going to really focus in on the municipal demands, and then we'll come back to the SSI and then show you how they all come together. And just for perspective, as we start focusing on the municipal part, the municipal is about 85% of that total municipal and self-supplied industrial baseline demand starting in 2015.
It looks like we've got a first question. Okay. We have a question via the chat from Alden Denenbrink. Hi, Alden. Where he says, why is there not a SWSI 2010 baseline data for the White and Republican basins?
Okay, I am so glad you asked that. So that will be explained in our documentation, but I kind of glossed over it. So the green, which is the update, was created with that breakdown so that it would fit neatly into the hydrologic models. So each of those is going to get fed into a separate hydrologic model. But for 2010, where we weren't tying it into the hydrologic models, the Republican was combined in the South Platte, and the White was combined with the Yampa. And so really, when you look at, if you're trying to look at the changes in the South Platte, it's not just a direct comparison, because 2010 would have had the Republican in it, and same for the Yampa, it would have had the White in it. But all of the demands for those basins have always still been in the projections and are today too.
Thank you.
Yes, good question. Okay, so we're gonna dive a little deeper into the methodology. Get a little more technical here. There are some aspects of the updated municipal methodology that are really similar to SWSI 2010. So at the core, both of them use a driver. We call it a driver, so some kind of factor that's influencing and multiplied by the per capita rate of use, which is in gallons per capita per day. So when we say GPCD, that's the per capita rate of use. And they both did prepare a range of possibilities of the future that reflect some uncertainties in the future municipal demands. Both of them, the analyses were prepared at a county level and then started with a baseline and projected it out to the future. So those are the main pieces that are the same, but then there are some really important differences. So in SWSI 2010, the main thing that was changing, and and driving the future projections was population. And in fact, and I'm going to explain this because it's something important when you go back and you try to look at the SWSI 2010 documentation and understand how to compare, because that's kind of human nature. We like to look back and see how we've changed. The 2010 first created a future projection that used the baseline GPCD, so the 2008 GPCD water use numbers, multiplied by a future population. And there was a low and a medium and high future population. So then it started with a future baseline demand. And if you look at the main documentation for SWSI 2010, a lot of those numbers in there are just that. It's the 2008 GPCD projected out into 2050 with a little bit of conservation from passive savings. But then when we started looking at the full potential of conservation savings, and that would be through programs that are implemented by water providers and changes that water users make, those were termed active conservation. And when we prepared the range of potential savings with the active conservation, that was only ever coupled with the medium population. So the active was never actually coupled with the low population and the high population, which is different from this update, because with the update and the scenario approach, what we have is we actually end up with 5 different projections. So each scenario, 5 different populations. So each scenario has a different population, and each scenario has a different per capita usage that reflects some amount of that passive and active conservation, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the full range of the active conservation. And that's because we were staying true to the narrative that Greg talked about in the water plan. And we'll show you on the next slide what we went through, kind of our logic to go through that. So we've moved away from this approach of talking about separate passive and active savings, and we just have now one future per capita rate of use. But that's something that can be looked at further at a more local level, is the active conservation, kind of like if you put it in the category of a IPMP project. So let's take a look next at the scenarios, and we'll try to walk you through the fun we had when we were trying to interpret these. So at the very top, again, that looks familiar. We've got the 5 scenarios, and we've got that combined ranking that we were trying to meet, which is, again, the lowest projection would be weak economy, and the highest would be the hot growth. And so I would say one of the key challenges of this whole project was taking a narrative description out of the water plan that was qualitative for the most part, and trying to turn that into quantitative numbers that we could fit into a methodology that made sense for projecting out demands into the future. And we had a lot of really great help with a technical advisory group we had a separate MNSSI advisory group that was made up of representatives throughout the state. So thank you to all those people who participated, and it really was an important part of the process. And then we had a lot of research that we did on these topics too to inform that group. So what I'm going to try to do here is walk you through a little bit of a flavor of each scenario and kind of what influenced our thinking on the different factors that affect the projection. So if we start on the left, and these are all keywords that we just cropped out of, I think it's chapter 6 of the water plan. We just cropped these out and we highlighted for this some of the ones that we really focused on. So if you start on the left, this is business as usual. The ranking is a 3 out of 5. So the volumetric demand projections we're trying to get right in the middle of the 5. And it's pretty self-explanatory, I think, in the title, but just some of these keywords, we've got recent trends continuing. We've got a climate that's similar to observed conditions in the 20th century, and that's something that's different in this update is that we actually have 3 different climates that we're going to introduce here. So the current and then 2 additional new ones. So business as usual is really kind of things continuing on the way that they've been in the past, but with some new population added in. Then if you go to the next one, scenario B, which is weak economy, it's got a similar climate to business as usual, but it's got a lower population growth. So that helps drive down the water demands, because remember, the demands are going to be a population times a per capita rate of use. And then the narrative talks about things like water users struggling financially. So there could be some decreases in per capita use because money is an issue. Maybe people are watching their water bills more. But then there's also some increases in water loss with infrastructure issues. So we really had to go back and forth on this with, again, this is supposed to come out the lowest ranking, but we've got things going on like water loss influencing it that we had to take into account. So now go to one over, cooperative growth. We're at scenario C, and this is now a ranking of 2, so somewhere between the 2 that we just talked about. And cooperative growth is now, it's back down to it's back up, I should say, to the current population growth rate. So more population than weak economy. And so it's more like business as usual in that respect, although we're going to show you the population distributes differently than with business as usual. But the narrative talks about things like mass transit leading to development in urban centers and mountain resort communities. So that really influenced how the population distributes across the state. And then it has a warmer climate. So that's going to lead potentially, likely, to some higher outdoor demands. But on the other hand, Coloradoans are embracing water and energy conservation, and new savings technology emerges. So that brings our demands back down lower to business as usual. And then finally on the right, we've got 2. We'll introduce these 2 together, adaptive innovation and hot growth. So in some ways, these 2 are alike. They both have a faster growing population. So they both have they have a similar statewide population, but it's going to be different, again, distributed throughout the state. These both have an even warmer climate. So these have the hot climate. And an important key difference between the 2 is that with adaptive innovation, we've got social values shifting. So now people feel the shared responsibility, and we've got technology that's helping mitigate the warmer climate. So that's offsetting some of the increase, and that's why we've got adaptive innovation. The goal here was to get adaptive innovation to come in under hot growth. Hot growth doesn't have the same technology, doesn't have the mitigation, so it's really clearly the high. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense, but again, all of this is qualitative and narrative, and we had to use this to play out with adjusting the per capita use and the population demand. So let's take a look at the population. As Greg talked about, BBC consultants prepared these population projections, and they did a great presentation in the February webinar. So if you didn't hear that, please follow up and listen to that, because it goes into much more in depth and much more background on how they got to this place. These are just the results that we're going to present on the population. And the population is still just a really big driver in the total volumetric demand. So there's a lot of moving parts, and we do have more things going on than in SWSI 2010, but still it's important for you to know population is a huge effect on the future volumes. So this chart, these are the results. It's got a lot going on, so I'm going to try to walk you through it starting on the left. And the 3 bars that are on the far left, if you look at the label underneath, these are all baseline demands, but the 2 that are in gray are related to SWSI 2010. So the far left is the actual baseline population that was used for SWSI 2010, and that was representing the year 2008. But then something really helpful that SWSI 2010 did is it provided projections at increments of time into the future. So there wasn't just one 2050 value. We actually had different pieces in time, and 2015 happened to be a year that we had a projection for. So, which you can see the second gray, that shows what SWSI 2010 projected we would be for 2015, and then the green bar that's labeled 2015 baseline, that's where we actually were in 2015. So what you can see is the green relative to the 2008 value, of course, probably no surprise to people, the population's increased since 2008, but it hasn't quite increased to the level that we had projected back in SWSI 2010. So we're starting a little bit lower than we had previously anticipated. And then if you move over to the right, those next 5 green bars, these are the results of the 2050 projections in the technical update. So the State Demographer's Office provides projections for 2050, and that became the business as usual, so the first bar on the left. And then all the others are versions that BBC prepared, and again, provide a bunch of info on that webinar, and there are also some fact sheets on that you can find online. The 3 bars, the 3 lines that you see on the top of the bars, and on our screen at least they're purple, blue, and kind of an orange color, those show the low, medium, and high population projections that we had from SWSI 2010. So what you'll see is none of the new population projections are as high as the previous SWSI 2010 high. And in fact, most of the projections fall around or below the medium from SWSI 2010. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as like I said, people go back and see how our projections are changing over time and try to understand why some of our differences in the end. When you try to dissect the differences of the volumetric demand projections, it's really important to first understand what the difference in the population projections are. And then it gets a little bit more complicated, but before we go back, just in the green bars to point out, at this level, it looks like there's only 3 population projections. So the weak economy is the lowest, the business as usual and the cooperative growth are the middle, and the adaptive innovation are the hot growth. And that's true. On a statewide level, there are 3 projections. But, now the next slide, please. When you look at the distributions on a county level, which is how BBC prepared the data for us for the projections, they're really different. Each scenario is actually different. And so, for example, with the middle statewide population that was used for business as usual and cooperative growth, what you can see here is if business as usual is the baseline just for this discussion to see how the other scenarios change around it. And this is really the movement of population throughout the state. So how much of that population grows into mountain resort communities, which are the blue bars, and how much is at urban centers, which is the red bars, and then the rest of the counties that weren't neatly defined in one of those 2 categories. For the middle projection, what you see is cooperative growth relative to the business as usual has more people moving to the mountain resort communities and the urban centers, and that plays into our demand projections. It also actually ends up playing into some of the agricultural demand projections. And then with the high statewide population, so the high was used for both the adaptive innovation and the hot growth, Again, you see more movement relative to just business as usual. You see more movement to the mountain resort communities and the urban centers with the adaptive innovation, and then with the hot growth, you see even more movement to the resort communities. And at least some of that is in response to climate effects. So that leads us next into another important topic, which is climate. So this, again, at the top, this will look familiar. This is part of that graphic out of the water plan. And as I previously mentioned, we have 3 different climates that we're looking at for this technical update. We have the current, which is that things would continue similar to what we've had throughout the 20th century. And then there's a hot and dry, which is based on information out of the Colorado Climate Plan, and there's a lot of good information on how the models that provided the information for this hot and dry and in between scenario were prepared, and how we ended up getting the factors that we use to adjust the outdoor demand. But there's the hot and dry, and then there's the in-between, which is kind of probably obvious. It's somewhere between what we've known in the 20th century and what would occur in the hot and dry. So again, on the climate topic, staying on the climate topic for a minute, these climate factors were applied to the outdoor portion of the municipal demands. Again, on a county level, but just for right here for this graphic, we've summarized it at a statewide level. And this is showing the per capita water use. So again, gallons per capita per day. And the statewide weighted average per capita water use for each of the 5 scenarios. In the green, which is what actually gets used in the projections, the combined effects with the climate effects. And then the gray, which was the starting point before we applied the climate factors to the outdoor use. So what you see on a statewide level is the GPCD typically increases by about 5 to 10 GPCD just due to that outdoor use, which that probably does not sound like a very big deal to most people on that scale. But at a county level, when you look at the way that these were applied to the individual county demands, we actually have 4 to 22% increase for the in-between scenario in the outdoor use, and 11 to 37% increase in the outdoor use for the hot and dry adjustments. So this is a pretty significant factor affecting future outdoor uses for the 3 scenarios that have a different climate approach. And something that's interesting, the way this works out with the narrative and with what we had to work with scenarios is, again, recall the last 2 scenarios on the right. So these are adaptive innovation and the hot growth. These both have the hot and dry climate factors applied, so the same hot and dry climate factors applied to outdoor uses. But look at how much lower, even on a statewide basis, and this becomes much more pronounced at a county level, look at how much lower the GPCD is for the adaptive innovation versus the hot growth. And that's really important. That is showing the effects of the technology mitigating the effects of the climate that was described in the water plan. So there's a lot of things like this that we see in the results that when you wonder why does that look like that, most of it comes back to those narrative descriptions and how we interpreted the Colorado Water Plan. Yes, please.
This is Greg again. I would just pipe up and say that scenario planning has many benefits that it offers, but there are also, potentially some drawbacks. So there's pros and cons like any approach that you take. And so certainly, I think what Bayorn just explained is one way that scenario is moving forward, with their interpretation of different drivers at a certain future date, can in some way have the effect of some of those drivers canceling each other out and muting the effects of different things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to keep in mind that this is definitely not a sensitivity analysis. We're not looking at one particular factor that's driving, municipal water use, gallons per capita per day, but instead it's this whole mixed bag of all these different things kind of brought together, as they were defined in each of those scenarios. So I think that's a really important point to keep as we move forward with not only today with our description about the municipal component, but also kind of more broadly with the technical analysis that we're doing this time.
It's a really important point. And the other thing that we had going on is, while it was really helpful to know what we were shooting for with these rankings of the 5, we also had that influencing things. So as we were interpreting what happens with climate change and what happens with technology, we were always coming back and checking to see, well, then what happens when we combine it all, and are we coming out with the rankings in the order and the sequence that we want? And maybe not surprising to people, but there are certain assumptions that you can make that would switch the order quite a bit. And so even though the population is a huge driver, the GPCD actually is fairly sensitive to how you interpret those factors. So here is, staying on GPCD, here is going a little deeper. I think this is the deepest we're going to go in the analysis before we give you the results. When we do the projections and we apply these factors for the influences of technology and behaviors and all of those things, we actually separately apply those to the different types of municipal uses, the different customer categories. So what we've got here is a breakdown. The pie chart on the left shows the baseline, so the year 2015. It shows how those different categories break out. And so green is residential indoor, gray is residential outdoor. The two of those together on a statewide basis, which you can see is on a statewide basis, on average, over half of the municipal demand is actually in the residential category. And then orange and blue are the non-residential indoor and outdoor, respectively. And then I think it's dark green on our screen, but kind of close to the dark gray. The 12%, that is what is labeled here as non-revenue water. And so if you go back and you try to find what that was in SWSI 2010, it was actually called water loss in 2010, but we've migrated to non-revenue water. And so it's an important topic. It's a significant amount of water in many areas throughout the state. And the way that we get that, and this is important to understand, the way that we get that is we take numbers that are reported that are just the total water put into a provider's system. So total water supplies coming out of a water treatment plant or coming out of wells, wherever the water's coming from, the raw water, all of that put out into the system. That's the distributed water. And then we subtract the metered end uses, which typically is coming out of billing data. So that difference is non-revenue water. And it includes things like physical leaks. So it's important to pay attention to because it could be a significant amount of water that is getting lost. But it also includes things like reporting and data issues, and even things like uses that might be metered but they're not billed, and the way that we're getting the number to subtract from is the billed data. So when you look at that category, as you get excited about it, you need to then kind of dig a little deeper and figure out what that number is. But for this methodology, we do track that, and we have a separate way of incorporating it into the projections, say, for example, than how we project the future impacts on outdoor uses. So the baseline, the pie chart shows the baseline, and then these 5 bar charts, stack bar charts, show how the per capita demands worked out in the future projections. Again, just keep in mind, we've got these projected for each county, and so they do look very different as you start looking within a river basin, but this is just the weighted average at a statewide level. And there was a lot of really good information, again, that came out of that technical advisory group and how to interpret all this, again, within the constraints of trying to come into the relative rankings that are in the water plan. So the next slide, this is the last one that's focused just on municipal. Again, it's got a ton of info, but these are the results. So after we did all of that with the population and then all of the different effects on the future per capita uses, we multiply them together, and this is what we get with the volumetric projections. So again, I'll try to walk you through this chart starting on the left. So similar to the prior ones you've seen, the first two bars on the left are the baseline. And so the gray, again, is the SWSI 2010 baseline, which represented the year 2008, and the green is our new baseline, so that's 2015. So you see a little bit, relatively small amount of increase since 2008, and all of that increase is due to population, because if you remember back, our new statewide average is 164 GPCD. So it's actually gone down from 172. So everything you see there in the increase in the baseline is due to population. And then the 5 green bars, just like before, the 5 green bars are going to be the demand projections, so one for each of the scenarios. And the lines now, they get a little bit more complicated, but the lines are different versions of projections from SWSI 2010. So trying to boil it down, I guess the big observations we took away from this is that the range of the 5 scenarios has narrowed a little bit here. We've got none of our projections are quite as high as the SWSI 2010 projection that just had the passive savings in the high population. Then again, none of them are quite as low as what we had when we took a really close look at the active savings potential from the SWSI 2010 medium population. So this is another reason why we say not all of the active potential savings is incorporated into these 5 scenario projections. There's still room for some additional active savings in them. The other thing that's kind of interesting here, and we did quite a bit of analysis on this, but the business as usual and the adaptive innovation projections are very similar. And I'll come back to that with the SSI after we add the SSI and we look at the total. But it's really interesting because the adaptive innovation has quite a bit more population in it, and it has the warmer climate. So even with those two things, with the amount of per capita use reduction that we had from the efficiency and the technology and the behavioral changes, it had a significant effect in that it, relative to the business as usual, it essentially mitigated those effects of higher population and climate. So stay tuned. We're going to now switch over to SSI, and then we'll come back and combine them all to show you the total. Okay, SSI. SSI is a relatively small amount of the baseline demand. And to give you some perspective, we didn't want to go too far into introducing the agricultural demands because that's going to be a whole topic of a webinar in April, but the blue pie chart that's at the top here, that is a rough representation of what the agricultural and MNSSI demands look like together. So the municipal and self-supplied industrial are coming in actually under 10% of the total statewide demand. But there are some important nuances to that you really need to understand before you go too far with using that fact. So it's just important, I think, when you try to keep in perspective. Then if you look at the red piece of the pie on the top and then follow it down, the SSI is about 15% of the combined MNSSI, but it's a really small part on a statewide basis. And I just point that out because I think conceptually, a lot of times we all have ideas of what we think industrial uses look like, and there are individual industrial uses that use a lot of water, but just for the scheme of this planning, on a statewide basis, it's a relatively small amount. That doesn't mean it can't be a big deal on a local basis. And then so we're going to get into kind of some of the differences in the technical update with the SSI. One of the things that's the same is in the technical update, we stayed with these 4 subsectors of SSI. And so these are energy development, large industry, snowmaking, and thermoelectric. And if you look at the pie chart on the right, you'll see is that over half of the SSI demand, so just the SSI category, over half of those on a statewide basis are associated with large industry. And these are users that have their own individual water supply, or they lease water from others, but they do it in a way where we can pull it out and be sure that it's not included in that municipal water use that we just talked about. The second largest category is thermoelectric, and then that's followed by energy development and snowmaking. And just kind of focusing in now on some of the differences between the two. Again, like I said, this SWSI 2010 and the update both have the 4 categories. The biggest difference is probably that the technical update incorporated some new data from targeted outreach and the base implementation plans. And this is a place where, again, the technical advisory group was really helpful, as well as some additional outreach that the CWCB conducted with some of these individual subsector categories. So that really the biggest change is the new data, and then that we needed to fit the projections into the 5 different scenarios. So this is this next slide. Again, I promised that we wouldn't be able to go too far into the individual basins, but one of the things about SSI that I thought is important to point out is that it really, again, is a relatively small amount of that combined M and SSI numbers, but there are basins, there are locations in the state where it's actually a bigger component of the uses than the municipal. So this chart, the green shows at a basin level the municipal uses, and the orange is showing the SSI. So for instance, in the Yampa, all the way over to the right, you can see that the SSI, the baseline SSI, is actually a more significant portion of the total demands than the Rio Grande. And then again, for anybody who can't quite see it, we can barely see it on our chart, but the North Platte and the white, they almost look like they're excluded from this chart, but they are in there. They're just really small. The total MNSSI is really small relative to some of the other basins. But when we document these uses and explain the projections, there's going to be an entire chapter devoted to each of those. So you'll be able to really understand what's going on in those basins, and it doesn't matter the scale, they're all represented there. Okay, so now taking you back to the work we had to do with trying to take these narrative descriptions from the water plan and turn them into numbers. And we really we did what we could here with this category, but we did not have as much information on the data. We didn't have as much new information as we had with municipal. So we were able to update the baselines for large industry, thermoelectric, and energy development demands using info from, again, like I said, the BIP and representatives of the tag and this additional outreach. For a lot of the individual uses within those categories. If we didn't have any new data, what we did is we projected from the SWSI 2010 data between the 2010 baseline and the 2050 value back from 2010. So what we're trying to do is bring these uses up to a 2015 baseline. And then for the snowmaking category, we were able to update the baseline with current snowmaking acreages, but we didn't have new information about how that category would change over time in the different scenarios. And specifically, we didn't have any published information about how that category might respond to climate change. And it's not to say that that industry isn't looking at that closely. We know they are. But one of the challenges we had is that a lot of that is not publicly available. And we just didn't have the connections, the involvement in those industries to be able to get information that they were comfortable with us using for this type of planning. So I think this is an area where the basin roundtables, to the extent that you can engage representatives from these type of industries, that's a place where we can really improve as we move forward with any kind of basin implementation plan updates or even getting ready for the next SWSI update, because what we learned from last time is it's not very long and then we'll be updating this again. So I would say that's an area for us to try to get a jump start on getting new information. But again, just keeping perspective, it's not a huge amount of the demand on a statewide level. Okay, so this is our second to last chart. For the SSI, this again is going to look familiar. We start on the left with the baseline. So for SSI, we've actually come down a little bit relative to the SWSI 2010 baseline. And that's to the extent that we were able to update the baseline, given all of the kind of limitations on data that I described. On the projections, so we've shown this in the stacked bar, thinking that it's kind of interesting to see how the subsectors of the SSI category vary. But again, the stacked bars, those are our 5 updated projections, and then the 3 lines that go across, those are the low, medium, and high SSI projections from SWSI 2010. So kind of similar to with Municipal, we don't see any of the updated projections reaching the high projection from SWSI 2010. In this category, most of them are actually below the low projection from SWSI 2010, and the hot growth is pretty close to what the medium projection from 2010 was. So now this is a really exciting part. This is the combined total demand, and we've got the municipal and self-supplied industrial combined here. The hatched areas are the SSI, and we do have this broken out by basin, and the documentation will be describing this type of information for every basin and what influenced it. What you don't see here, and what we didn't do, is try to bring this back to a comparison of the SWSI 2010 low, medium, and high. And that's because it's very challenging to do in any way that is consistent with all of the different assumptions. So if that's something that's important to people to do, it's something that we'll need to look at on a more topical basis, because you have to make a lot of choices of whether you pick the medium population and the different type of active savings that we talked about and all of those things. But there are still some really interesting results here. So the 5 relative rankings that we've been talking about, we almost hit those on a combined level. We didn't quite get to them because the business as usual came in just slightly, and it's hard to even see it on this chart, but it came in just slightly higher than the adaptive innovation, but it's actually within less than 0.5% difference. So they're very close. And as I'd mentioned before, we did a lot of sensitivity around that to see if we couldn't have those break apart from each other more, but it really was just not possible without pushing some of the assumptions beyond what we thought were reasonable. The couple of kind of comparisons that we thought are interesting to look at here is that the fact that the business as usual and the adaptive innovation are so similar, again, really points to what innovative demand management measures can do. And so with adaptive innovation, we've got a lot more population, a lot hotter climate, and yet it's essentially coming out the same as business as usual. And that's all about the technology and the behavioral changes that we've got going on, coupled with some of the industrial type of changes that are reflected in the SSI. Then another one that, again, we'll just come back to that's very interesting to look at is the adaptive innovation and the hot growth, because those both have the same population. They both have high population. They both have the hot climate, but we've got a lot lower demand with the adaptive innovation, and really the biggest difference. So we were always shooting for the hot growth to have the highest and the adaptive innovation to be the next down from that, the next highest. But if you look at this, some of the biggest difference is really between those two, the adaptive innovation and the hot growth. So again, it just shows what can happen with some of the demand management mitigating the future effects of climate. So just really quickly in summary, before we turn it over to questions, the key takeaways we'd like you to have from this is there's just a lot of really good new data. We have a significant amount of new information on the municipal demands. We're really excited about using that 1051 data and anything more we can get out of water efficiency plans and BIPs. I guess the ask would be that we start to get the better data also on the SSI category, but we did have some good information, and most of what we had was through individual participants, either on the tag or people that we reached out to. So we're very appreciative of that, and it was all used, and we really appreciate relying on those industrial experts for that type of data. And then the other big takeaway is population and climate are significant drivers in these scenarios, and you see this and how they come out relative to one another. But there's still a lot that we see going on with the varying levels of municipal water use efficiency and the different uses in SSI. So that is a summary. If you want to add anything, Greg?
No, thank you, Bayor, and I think that was a wonderful summary of the methodology. We certainly wanted to open it up for questions. Just a quick reminder for the sake of any potential participation from anyone in future technical webinars, we do have a feedback form where we've requested questions in advance of each of these webinars so that we can help really target our presentation and our discussion about any of those hot spots or burning questions that you might have. We did not have any questions in advance of this webinar, and we certainly will open up the line now, and feel free to use the chat box, and we'll stay on. We've got, I believe, the next 15-20 minutes or so reserved, but we certainly respect your time and don't need to take the whole time, but I'm happy to answer any questions if we can. I'll also remind folks that we will be posting the recording of this on the website. So the hope is that this can really serve as a resource for folks that do have questions about how we went about the various components of this analysis, and that we can really direct folks with some of those tough questions to use the webinar to help get some of these answers. But We also are always available as well, and I think most folks know where to find us as far as our email and phone information.
Oh, come on, I have put everybody to sleep. There is nobody there.
You answered everyone's question.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Got to be a couple of questions out there.
They're just absorbing.
It's a lot. It is a
There's
lot.
a lot of information.
Yeah.
It's a lot of info.
And I think when we release the study, we'll have a lot. We'll give it just another minute or two. If folks want to pipe up, we still have, looks like, a number of people on the line. And I don't believe we actually muted people on our end. This was a good crowd this time. Sometimes we've got a lot of feedback and side conversations. So. Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and end the call now. But again, feel free to always reach out with other questions or comments that you might have, and thanks again for your attendance.